Welcome to Dispatches, the official podcast for the Journal of the American Revolution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Journal of the American Revolution contributor Keith Muchowski, and he'll be talking about the life of Richard Varick, Revolutionary War hero and eventual mayor of New York City. Keith Muchowski, thank you for joining us.
Oh, Brady, thank you so much. It's good to be back.
Keith, tell us a little bit about your background. You've been on before. Remind our viewers about yourself.
Sure. My name is Keith Muchowski. I'm a librarian and professor at New York City College of Technology, which is part of CUNY, City University of New York. And my particular campus is in downtown Brooklyn, beautiful downtown Brooklyn. And I also volunteer with the National Park Service, which I have been doing for more than 15 years now. And I've been at Ellis Island and Governor's Island and Grant's Tomb and the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. And I was really always kind of a Civil War guy until a fateful trip in June of 2018 to the Museum of the American Revolution, which kind of spun me off in this direction. And in 2022, I had the good fortune of receiving from the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati a fellowship, which was sponsored by the Massachusetts State Chapter to do research at the ARR Library at Anderson House there on DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And so it's been an interesting ride.
Keith, tell us what drew your interest into this man's life.
Well, Richard Varick is an interesting figure, and to me, it started out as a local story because his great grandparents came to Brooklyn in the late 17th century from the Netherlands. By this time, New York State was already a British colony, but they joined the Dutch enclave here in Brooklyn, and so the Van Varicks, as they were known, still known at this time, were part of the Dutch diaspora around the world, and some of the Van Varicks who settled here in Brooklyn had been in the Dutch Pacific and some of the colonies over there, and eventually some of them settled here in Brooklyn. They were traders. They traded goods from around Dutch colonies around the world. Some of them were religious leaders in the Dutch Reformed Church. One of them, Rudolphus van Varick, opposed the Leisler Rebellion here in New York City. And eventually the Van Varicks drop the Van and they become the more anglicized Varicks, and the family spreads and multiplies across what are today New York State, Connecticut, New Jersey, and elsewhere. So it's a really fascinating story that's both local and global all at the same time.
Excellent. So much of it is. So Keith, what do we know about Varick's early life? He's a figure that obviously comes to prominence as he matures in the Revolutionary Age. What did you find about his life growing up?
Well, there's a fair amount actually, and he was born in Hackensack, New Jersey in 1753, just prior to the start of the 7 Years' War, and he was baptized in the Dutch Reformed Church there in Hackensack. It was a very bucolic upbringing, very well-tended farms owned by people largely of Dutch stock who spoke Dutch in the home. Many of them did. Certainly spoke Dutch when they went to church. And young Richard Varick was homeschooled and studied Latin, studied Greek, and eventually, after he turned 18 in 1771, he moved across the way to New York City. And he clerked for a figure who people don't really know too much about anymore, which is unfortunate, named John Morin Scott. It's an interesting figure in and of himself. And J.M. Scott, along with William Smith Jr. and also William Livingston, comprised what were called then and now the Triumvirate. And they were the three leading attorneys in the colony of New York prior to the Revolution. And so young Richard Varick clerks for John Scott and is eventually authorized to practice law in New York in 1774, and he becomes a partner of John Moore and Scott. So that's kind of how he came of age.
Keith, I love New York City. The history is sort of overwhelming. You can almost pick what period of American history you want to focus on when you visit there. Tell us about, though, New York in the 1770s. What kind of environment was that?
Well, New York in the 1770s, the city of New York, along with Philadelphia and Boston and Charleston, these were really the four major cities in the colonies at this time. New York City was much smaller, of course, than it is today. Most of it was also much. It was also much dirtier, and the rich and poor were kind of crammed together in the lower tip of southern Manhattan. It was a port city. Was New York traded with the Caribbean, with the West Indies, and with Europe. Um, there were a lot of taverns and coffee shops where a lot of business actually got conducted. Many languages then and now were spoken in New York City. Also, the currency was from around the world. If you did business in New York City, you might be trading not just in British pounds, but you might be dealing in Spanish pieces of eight or French livre or other paper and metal currency from around the world. It was also the headquarters of General Thomas Gage, who was the British commanding general prior to, in the decade or so prior to the outbreak of the revolution. And so it's a much smaller city than it is today. Some cultural and professional institutions were coming into their own. King's College, what is today Columbia University, was founded in 1754. Was also then that the Livingston and others in that same year founded the New York Society Library. The New York Chamber of Commerce, which still exists, was founded in 1768. It's kind of interesting how a lot of those organizations um, were founded at this time and still are still with us today. And so it was a very fascinating place, very you know very in many ways still like it is today, and yet so far removed from us at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. So, Keith, tell us about how Varick first gets involved in the Patriot movement.
Sure. Well, I think he really imbibed the radicalism from John Moore and Scott, who was one of the founders of the Sons of Liberty in New York during and immediately after the Stamp Act crisis of a decade earlier. Alexander McDougall, another Son of Liberty, was another big influence. Varick uh, became involved in what we today call the Livingston faction. The Livingston family were largely they were wealthy individuals, largely from the Hudson Valley, who owned big homesteads up there, and who competed in business and in the law in other areas with the Delanceys, who were largely merchants who lived in New York City. So Varick becomes part of the Livingston faction, and so as I said earlier, he moved here in 1771, and when he was 18, and so in the few years after that, he's imbibing these things that are taking place. He would have seen New York's version of the Tea Party, which was in 1774. It was also in 1774 that New York's Committee of 51, uh, New York's Committee of Correspondence, wrote a letter to the Boston, their counterparts in Boston, suggesting a meeting of the colonies, which eventually what we today call the First Continental Congress. So these are things that Varick would have been in, he would have been in the middle of all these things, maybe because he was a younger man, like more as a secondary player, if you will. But people like his mentor, John Scott and McDougall and others, William Livingston and William Smith Jr., he would have been, John Jay was a good friend. He would have, Varick would have been absorbing all of this at the time.
Yeah, so we see Keith Varick involved in some of the major battles of the Revolution early on in the war. Your article does a great job of really tracing his whole experience. Tell us about his early involvement in the conflict in the Northeast.
Yeah, his military career is interesting, and it really kind of breaks down very conveniently into two halves. And the first half is from 1775 to 1780. And he was appointed a captain in the 1st New York, which was actually commanded by now Colonel Alexander McDougall, he was appointed captain in late June of 1775, so very early in the war. And just a few days later, on July 1st, he is also commissioned to be a secretary to General Schuyler, Philip Schuyler. And so General Schuyler and Captain Varick, they leave New York City for Fort Ticonderoga and arrive there in late July of 1775. And Varick is involved helping organize the attack on British Canada that would take place later that year, where General Montgomery famously died on December 31st, 1775, who was a very good friend of Richard Varick. And you would have at least been aware of Benedict Arnold at this time. And Varick, he stepped down from from the first New York in September of 1776. But the Continental Congress just after that appointed him as deputy muster master for the Northern Department, which was commanded by Philip Schuyler. And in the following year, promoted him to lieutenant colonel. And as a lot of listeners might know, Schuyler is eventually relieved of command, and Gates takes over, Ratio Gates. And so now he's serving under Gates, and he actually does Varick, he witnesses Burgoyne's surrender to Gates at the Battle of Saratoga. And so he basically spends the first decade of the war from 1775 to 1780 in Albany, at Fort Ticonderoga, at other spots in upstate New York. And eventually in January of 1780, he loses his job, not because he had done anything wrong, but because in January of 1780, the Continental Congress decides to get rid of the muster department. And so in this restructuring, Varick is, he and other deputy muster masters lose their jobs. So he goes back in early 1780 to New Jersey, where his where his family is. Of course, he can't go to New York City because it's under British occupation, and he does some light infantry duty with the local militia, which was commanded by his uncle, Colonel Eunice Dye, and and he does some lawyering in 1779. The now governor of New Jersey, William Livingston, who had been part of the triumvirate with John Moore and Scott, um, um, signs the paperwork, if you will, to allow Richard Varick to practice law now in New Jersey. So he can practice law now in New Jersey as well as New York State. And this is basically what he does for the first half of 1780, kind of cooling his heels, wondering what the next thing is going to be.
Yeah, pretty surprising in your article. He will fall in eventually with Benedict Arnold, and they seem to be a pretty good pair. How does he fall in with Arnold, and then how does he ultimately get ensnared in the controversy that ensues?
Yeah, I think he fell in with Arnold because in July of 1780, um, Commander-in-Chief Washington spends July of 1780 at the home of Colonel Teunusdai, who again was Richard Varick's uncle. So Varick would have known who Washington would have known who Varick was, and Arnold also already would have known who Varick was through through Arnold's relationship to the Northern Department um, in the years leading up to that. And Arnold needed a secretary, and so in August of 1780 he offers Arnold offers Varick the job, and wasting no time, Varick leaves New Jersey and he goes up to West Point, where he's now serving under Benedict Arnold, and starts to notice quite quickly Benedict Arnold's curious behavior up there.
What happens to Varick as a result of Arnold's treachery? He gets pulled into that, right? So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, he does get pulled into it. Actually, he the the day that Arnold's treachery is discovered, Varick himself is put under arrest. He's detained and he's eventually let go, but there's a cloud of suspicion over him, and he basically demands satisfaction, if you will. He demands a court of inquiry, and he first he couldn't at first he couldn't do that because he was feeling ill, and he writes a letter to eventually, once he gets better, he writes a letter to General Washington, who again is staying at the home of his uncle Colonel Dye in New Jersey, and says, I want my court of inquiry. I want to clear my name. And they do that. They do that in the fall of 1780. And eventually, Varick's name is cleared. And that's the story on that.
So, pretty impressive after the war, not to spoil it, but Varick will go on to become mayor of New York City. Keith, can you connect those dots for us? How does he rise to such tremendous heights?
Well, after his time with Arnold, I should say, the Varick eventually in the following year in 1781, General Washington offers uh, Varick the job as his recording secretary. So Varick spends the last 2 years of the war in Poughkeepsie, supervising a team of transcribers who are transcribing and collating and organizing General Washington's papers. And eventually, of course, evacuation day comes in November of 1783. And when the war ends, Varick settles in Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan. He's a Federalist. And in 1786, he marries Maria Roosevelt, the daughter of Isaac Roosevelt. In this time, he along with another attorney named Samuel Jones, who is a lawyer who eventually becomes known as the father of the New York bar. He helps codify New York State's legal codes, which, after a century of British rule, had to be updated for the for the now independent state of New York within the United States. So he spends a few years on that. He has positions of increasing responsibility. He holds increasingly um, he holds offices that are increasingly prestigious. And in October of 1789, he is appointed the governor. He is appointed by the governor as the mayor of of New York City. Holds that job actually basically throughout the Federalist period. Holds a job from October 1789 until 1801.
Hmm.
So it's a very when he was when he was mayor of New York City, he dealt with things like the yellow fever pandemic. The Citizen Genet affair took place here in New York City during his mayoralty. Um, the uh, the rioting that took place over anger about the John Jay Treaty. He was mayor at that time. He supported the Jay Treaty, and so these are the quasi war. The quasi war took place during his mayoralty, and these are some of the things. He also does other things, like as mayor, he commissions portraits of George Washington and also George Clinton, the governor of of New York State. And today, those are part of the collection that are housed in City Hall in Lower Manhattan. They've been there for more than 2 centuries now. It's one of the great crown jewels of early Americana, is New York City's portrait collection. It's extraordinary.
Wonderful. Okay, Keith. So, tell us, what do you think should be Varick's legacy? You've studied him. You've published about him. How do you come down on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he's a neglected figure for several reasons. First of all, he and Maria had no children, so there was no one there. There was no direct family to keep the legacy going, if you will. I think his Dutch heritage, as opposed to um, a lack of British heritage, if you will, influenced, it partly explained why we don't know more about him. He spent a lot of time in New York, but he also owned a home, he and Maria, in New Jersey. And so each state can kind of claim him for their own, if you will. Like his influence is kind of diluted, if you will. And he wasn't one of the writers or signers of any of our founding documents. So I think he's kind of seen as a secondary figure, which I really regard as very unfortunate. He was a staff officer for everywhere. One thread that goes through Richard Varick's life is that everywhere he goes, he ends up in the innermost circle, and he ends up as a young man, just a kid, all of 18, clerking for the triumvirate in the early 1770s. When the war breaks out, he ends up on the staff of Philip Schuyler, and then Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, and eventually George Washington himself. Um, Also, I think we could really regard Richard Varick as one of the early historians of the war. All his time as the recording secretary for General Washington, um, all that work he did are what today are called the Varick transcripts, which are held in the Library of Congress, and also most of it is on Founders Online now. So when you go to if you Google, well, not Google, but if you type in Varick transcripts in Founders Online, just sit back and see what pops up. But also, he's very important in the history of the war, and also I think in the memory of the war, because the last 25 years of his life, from 1806 until his own death in 1831, he was the president of the New York State chapter of the Society of the Cincinnati. He was actually a founding member of the society going back to 1783, and he becomes the president of the New York State chapter in 1806. And among other things that happened under Varick's leadership of the New York State Society was in 1818, he and the society arranged the reinterment of General Montgomery. His remains were removed from Quebec, and with much pomp and circumstance, he was reinterred in St. Paul's Chapel in Lower Manhattan. He was one of the organizers of Lafayette's Grand Tour of 1824, 1825, which we are currently commemorating the bicentennial of, and he played a major hand in that. And Lafayette was a good friend. He was, of course, they both served in Washington's inner circle, and he also helped arranged the funeral in July of 1831 of President James Monroe, who had famously died on the 4th of July in 1831, 55th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And, when we think of large presidential funerals in New York City, what first comes to mind is the funeral of Ulysses S. Grant. But before Ulysses S. Grant, we had the funeral of James Monroe, which was witnessed by as many as 100,000 people by some counts. This was in a city of about 200,000 at the time. So it was, Varick had a big hand in that. And so he did a lot of things, Richard Varick did. First of all, he helped win the American Revolutionary War. Then he helped codify New York State jurisprudence after the war and guided the city throughout the Federalist period. And so he was certainly a major figure in the war, and someone I think that I think we would be well served to know more about.